See, that is actually a very good counter argument to what I was saying, and it's totally valid. And in fact, I mean, I suppose this is as good a time as any to go through the response to the forbidden argument, because they have, and I knew this was going to happen. And so it's really about the framing that she had presented, as in, I should be celebrated for being a childless old woman, and this something we celebrate is something worthy of emulation. And that's the point. It's a bad standard set. So this is why I call it the forbidden argument, because essentially it's the civilizational argument, the argument that you're part of a civilization. Now, Atara's point, of course, very well taken. She is right that it would be better to have her not propagating these very dangerous left-wing ideals, but it also accepts the framing that the old lady without children has created. So I thought I'd go through it. And I've got a few notes. Unfortunately, it's going to be quite dull. It's going to be me making points, but let me know what you think about the end of it. So we did receive a lot of emails about this, and so I wanted to make the argument in a more subtle and nuanced way that I wasn't in the other one. But the question fundamentally is about whether the individual owes society at large for something. But when we say society, we tend to think of a sort of single snapshot in time, whereas if we think of it in a more sort of longitudinal way, then we're talking about the civilization itself. Do we owe British civilization something? And I think there is an argument to say yes, we do. It's a question of moral rectitude between what is right and wrong, and the implication is that people who choose not to have children are committing some kind of sin, some kind of moral infraction. And so naturally, many people who don't have children and couldn't have children felt a bit sort of, put out by this. Saying, well, hang on, why am I a bad person because I was deprived of the opportunity of doing this thing? And why should I be considered a bad person for that? And obviously, I don't think they should. But I didn't stake out the ground adequately, so I thought I would do it in a fairly comprehensive way, hopefully here. So, it is true that we are born, whether we approve of this or not, and we are raised before we have the capacity to be a self-sustaining person in the world. This gives us a kind of debt, a kind of obligation, a kind of understanding that actually you do owe something to other people because other people gave something to you out of a system of obligation. Your parents are obliged. What are you giving me the look for?
Depends on whether or not what they gave you was good, I think.
Well, yeah, okay. We're talking in general terms. If you can think of an exception, ignore it, because we're talking about the rule, right? The exceptions do not prove the rule. They don't define the rule. They are defined by the rule. And so if my rule is true and you can think of an exception, then you're saying my rule is correct.
The thing in my mind is just like, well, there are only certain civilizations, I would say, that are a net positive, that if you grow up in, you're being
it doesn't matter, right? Because that's just your feeling about the civilization.
Okay.
Right? But from an abstracted standpoint, whether you agree with the civilization or not, you can agree to this formulation, right? So the point is, we rely on others. They have an obligation to us, parents and adults as well. Adults have an obligation. If you see a kid wandering around lost in the street, you've got an obligation to help that kid find its parents, take them to the police, whatever it is, right? You help a child who's lost, and you'd have to be a monster to be like, I don't know that kid anything, and walk on. What an awful person you would have to be, right? And so there is moral obligation on you here, because we enjoyed the grace that brought us to the time and place where we were healthy, functioning adults, and therefore we have an obligation not only to help other people, but like to support and endorse the system that has produced us, assuming we think the system is good and we're good people and that we can do good things. But I think that it is a fairly good system that we, at least in Britain, have, and we should acknowledge its virtues. So to maintain this system, we must first value it, which is intangible. It's just intention-based. Doesn't mean we have to do anything. We probably don't even have to profess the values on most things. We just have to just get on with our lives, which is which is the second point, which is working within its boundaries and towards its goals. So it's a passive action, not working against the system. So as you just go about your daily life, you follow the rules, you obey the law, you help out your neighbor if they don't have some sugar or something. Don't have some keto-friendly food, you can give them and just be a part of society and not work against society and the civilization itself. Now, you can take this further and obviously produce children to continue it, which is a very active action. It's something very proactive you're doing to actually promote the civilization, which is one of the reasons why you'll find leftists going, well, white people shouldn't have children, because they know this. They know that if you have children, you'll instill, as Tara said, instill those children with your values, and those values will go on to be replicated in them and their children. And this is how a civilization exists over time and space. This is how it continues. And if you can't do that because life isn't fair and some people have these options and opportunities denied to them, then there is an alternative course of sort of active, proactive action, which is activism in service of it, and trying to persuade people, or becoming a teacher and helping to kids to learn, or adopting other kids, or various other things that you can do if you personally can't be a part of that sort of continuity of civilization. But for any of this to be a moral consideration, it has to be something that you had a choice over, because there's no point shaming someone or praising someone for things they personally couldn't do or couldn't change. And so if you never have the choice of becoming a parent, one cannot rightly say that you did something wrong by not becoming a parent, even if the general theme of society is family good. Follow me?
Yep.
Doesn't seem objectionable. If it wasn't an option for you to have children, so I mean, it could be that you were just simply unable to find a husband. You as a woman may have been in various relationships trying to make them work. So you tried to form a marriageable partner, and for some reason, bad luck or bad choices or whatever, this just didn't happen, and that's not your fault. You did your best. And so you shouldn't be judged by that, or it might be that you're infertile, or there could be any number of reasons. But the point is, because it was out of your control, it would be improper to place blame, at least beyond a certain point. Especially if you happen to be supportive of this kind of culture as well. So I just want to say I apologize to anyone who felt that I was having a go or anything like that. I wasn't. I just wasn't being very nuanced when I was presenting my forbidden argument, because of the way that the woman had presented hers. But I do think it is still important to, in the abstract, have sort of a theoretical, generally positive view towards this civilizational perspective, and understand that in general, it might not be for every individual case, especially if it's been denied by reasons outside their control, that we do have this sort of positive attitude, because otherwise, well, it can be replaced with anything destructive. And I think that these cultural narratives that define the structures and the standards to which we aspire are important, which is why I'm actually very sympathetic to those sorts of late millennial women who are now realizing tragically that they've been sold a lie and are being forced to miss out on one particularly fulfilling aspect of life. They were told that they could have kids when they were 40. Well, maybe not. Nature isn't a very forgiving mistress in this way. And so this, I can, the woman, the meme of the woman who froze her eggs, then 10 years later, all of them failed and she's screaming on the floor. I feel bad for her, but she was sold a lie that she could defer her fertility, and that wasn't the case. So in the context of speaking to the 53-year-old socialite who feels that she owes nothing to anyone, I think that the forbidden argument can be deployed effectively, because she's acting like she's some kind of ethereal being who floats atop of civilization, when in fact she contributes precious little, and there's a certain kind of service that is expected generally of everyone, even if, and obviously that's deferred if you can't fulfill that service, but there's a general expectation that you should have children, and there is, in my opinion, a moral failing from this elderly lady for failing to do her part, but not just failing to do it, but just openly repudiating it, openly saying, no, I'm better than that, or, I don't have to do that. It's like, well, sure, but you are taking without giving, and so there is a failure on her part there. And the important part here is to note that this is a consequence of the active choice on her part. This isn't something that was forced upon her. This is something that she chose and glories in. It's something she revels in, and she's trying to use as an example for other women. And I think that's a bad idea. So even if let's give her the most charitable position, even if she was like, yeah, no, I'm genuinely happy and fulfilled being a 53-year-old singleton with no children. Okay, maybe you are, but for most women, I don't think that's going to be the case. And I think it would be irresponsible to promote that as a civilizational narrative. I hope that explains my forbidden argument, that how actually civilization, you kind of have a debt to it. And this is, I think, true. Any rebuttals?
Not really so much a rebuttal. I've just got two things I find of interest. Like that
Sure.
caveat you had to add of we presume that you like the civilization, I think has to be there.
Yeah.
Because it's the example of like, well, what if you grew up in a Satanist society and you hate Satanism because it doesn't produce any good outcomes? You're like, no, I'm not going to contribute to the society's continuation. Fine. Yeah, makes perfect sense, right?
Sure.
But there's people pointing out that tradition is just peer pressure from your ancestors. I mean, sort of true, sure. But if you agree with your ancestors that what they produced seems to be good, well, then you probably should uphold it.
Why would you assume they were bad people?
Well, if they have produced a tradition that's awful, for example, I don't know,
Sure,
like
it could
burning
be.
widows,
Yep.
you'd be like, well, it's not good. We shouldn't keep that around, and therefore you wouldn't uphold that part.
Sure.
So-
But the point is, it's ours to deal with, and it's our responsibility to deal with it in our own time. And it could be that this is, as you say, a tradition that needs to go, but it could also be that the tradition includes a certain reason, or not this particular one, obviously, that burning widows, but like the tradition of being polite to your parents. It's about upholding a certain kind of standard, because you end up with a certain kind of civilization that has a certain kind of texture and a certain moral gradient, and if you want that to be higher, then you've got to try and aspire to those standards. You've got to uphold them. And this is why, you might say, well, it's the dead lecturing us, maybe, but they probably learned a few things that we stand to learn ourselves. So I don't think we should be so arrogant as to think we are beyond it, because I don't think we are.
The only other thing I had in mind was, sure, it might be great if someone with a completely, bat-S ideology doesn't have kids that they then indoctrinate them with. I mean, I'm thinking of Islamists, for example, who teach their kids to essentially become terrorists, in my mind. But, I mean, at least they don't become professors as well. That's the other thing to keep in mind.
I guess.
Like, think about all the far-left professors who go in there and they just indoctrinate other people's kids.
Yep.
It's also something to keep in mind. But apart from that, I got nothing.
Yep.
So
There we go. So basically, radical left-wing professors and deliberately childless old women, leeches. If you enjoyed this segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can watch the full broadcast live every weekday at 1 p.m. UK time on lotuseaters.com.